so this paper was basically the paper I presented at the Historical Materialism Conference, and we had a great discussion there with the people who came to the panel. So I'm really looking forward to any comments, critique, or suggestions. I'm really excited about having the opportunity to hear what people who are interested in these issues think. And probably it will be one of the most boring of the papers that will be presented, so apologies for starting myself. But we just thought that because I had the paper ready, I would just go on and present it. So okay, so I will so we'll just start. And and sorry, I will need to read through my script, not to mess up my presentation. Okay, so if your activism ignores disability, it is not activism. This is the challenge that disabled activists have repeatedly brought to social and anti-capitalist movements. At the same time, Marxist theory has endeavored to interrogate the opposition between class and so-called identity politics. So bringing into conversation insights from autonomous Marxism with disability studies and politics, in this paper, I will develop the concept of Crip Compositionisms to explore the ways in which recognizing disability, its rightful place within the working class and class struggle, can transform the understandings and practices of both. Crip Compositionisms pursue the insertion of a disability logic and presence within working class autocritique, a term that some of you may be familiar with, but that I will explain, and anti-capitalist organizing alike. They can help us delineate, I will suggest, how this logic and presence of disability inflects the political recomposition of the working class and the horizons of class struggle. So my analysis will unfold within the framework of a Crip autonomist Marxism. That is, as a form of Crip intersectional Marxism that intervenes in the debate over the relationship between identity and class politics to make space for an autonomist understanding of the socioeconomic and political phenomenon of disability under capitalism and within class struggle. So building on Ashley Borer's notion of an intersectional Marxism, or a Marxist theory of intersectionality that, in her words, seeks to account for the relations of domination and exploitation organized around race, class, gender, and sexuality, my own contribution engages in the cripping of intersectional Marxism through the insertion of a disability logic and presence, following the practice of cripping theorized by Robert McClure and others. So as Crip intersectional Marxism, both registers the multiple ways in which disabled people's oppression is incredibly complex and intrinsically bound up with capitalism, in the words of Ellen Clifford, and seeks to conceptualize disability as a product of capitalism. Disability as a socio-political phenomenon is produced by normalcy, or the system that, in the words of Rosemary Garland Thompson, enforces normality by upholding some impossible standard to which all bodies must adhere. As a socioeconomic phenomenon, disability is created by capitalism by virtue of the ways in which normalcy sustains capitalist processes of production and social reproduction. Non-normative body minds press against the capitalist conception, theorized and entrenched by Marxist theory in turn, of a homogeneous mass of human labor, as what, in Marx's own words, as what makes up the totality of productive labor power, and as composed of individual units of labor power, each of which is, in Marx's words, the same as any other, to the extent that it has the character of a socially average unit of labor power. So the possibility to calculate the average degree of skill and intensity of labor prevalent in a given society, Marx says, and organize for the extraction of surplus value on its basis, is undermined by the very existence of disabled people, I will argue. So the decenter position that disabled people occupy with respect to temporarily abled workers under capitalism underpins the social marginalization that is bound up with disability. And disability theorists have examined how exclusion from wage labor lies at the core of disabled people oppression in every aspect of modern life, as Martha Russell and Ravi Malhotra have argued. So it is being denied the opportunity to work, as Mike Oliver says, to make a material contribution to the well-being of society that translates into disabled peoples becoming perceived as other or useless. So from the perspective of a Crip intersectional Marxism, the demonization of disabled people in this conjuncture functioned to entrench the capitalist status quo in a moment of crisis, alongside the mainstream centralization of remunerated work as a driving force of one's life, in the words of Tanya Aho, that is central to the reproduction of capitalism. So alongside an intersectional analysis of capitalist oppression, as Kummer, Gibriel, Elliot Cooper, and Diver point out in historical materialism, it is important in their special issue on intersectional Marxism, it is important to undertake an examination, It is important to undertake an examination of the ways in which identities are categories of lived experience, constructions, and starting points for organizing. So for this reason, they should be considered not only a modality in which class and therefore capitalism is lived, but also one through which its power is continually made and remade. So with this in mind, a Crip intersectional Marxism is concerned for me with the location of disability under capitalism as what affords a specific angle from which to launch a challenge to the logics and operations of capital. And it is on this basis that a Crip intersectional Marxism connects directly and shades into a Crip autonomist Marxism, which locates a disability logic and presence within the working class as the motor of change and foundation of any perspective of struggle. So centering this perspective of struggle in class analysis is a defining feature of what autonomist Marxist Mario Tronti calls a working class autocritique. So I'll just check that. Oh, I think I got. I'm very sorry. So this is okay. This is okay. So yeah. So for Tronti, a working class autocritique. For Tronti, the defining feature of a working class autocritique is the political task to question the entire past historical course of workers' class struggle, as well as the current state of organization of the working class. So working class autocritique rejects a mode of analysis that puts capitalist development first and workers second, and seeks to reverse the polarity and start again from the beginning. And the beginning is the class struggle, Tronti says, of the working class, as what directs a given form of capitalist development. So if a working class autocritique provides a standpoint from which to organize and to achieve an understanding of class, from an autonomist perspective, both this standpoint and the working class itself are defined by the ways in which the working class struggles. On the one hand, as Tronti explains, analyzing forms of class struggle is an important passage in reconstructing the working class point of view. On the other, understanding what the working class is not possible without seeing how it struggles. So a Crip autonomism starts in the spirit of the activity of disabled people's movements, such as disabled people against CAT, who have entered the class struggle in their own right. in the words of Ellen Clifford, in a conscious departure from the identity politics era of disability or campaigning, and with the explicit aim of building alliances and joining the wider anti-capitalist movement. So in the spirit of an autonomist reversal of perspective that starts from a perspective of struggle, it continues by reversing the social model of disability while starting with it that this group have followed as a tool developed by disabled people as a guide for social action, as Ellen says. So the social model distinguishes between impairment and socially created disability, so as to be able to fight the barriers that create the latter. A Crip autonomist Marxism and a Crip autonomist perspective for me builds upon this model, the social model of disability through reversal, by reflecting on the production of disability under capitalism as what yields clues as to ways in which we may want to value, learn, and start from the anti-capitalist power of non-normative or real body minds. First, as not productive of capitalism, because as I will discuss, not contributing to processes of valorization and not partaking in the reproduction of the capital-labor relation. And second, on this basis, as providing a unique starting point for building collective resistance against capital. So Tronti frames in terms of class composition analysis, working class autocritique, which asks of itself the following question. How is the working class composed internally? How does it function within capital? How does it work? How does it struggle? In what sense does it tacitly accept the system, and in what form does it strategically refute it? Class composition analysis generates the possibility to bring about a positive strategic moment for the revolution by mapping out and taking control of the interplay between the technical composition of capital at the international level and the political recomposition of the working class. So social composition analysis grasps how a new cloth must be woven, in the words of Tronti, cut and sewn into the expanded horizons of today's worker struggle, to gain insight into how to continually recompose the material figure of the collective worker against capital, which itself seeks to dismantle this figure. So Crip composition analysis inserts into it a disability logic and presence as what haunts the technical composition of capital and demands inclusion within the political recomposition of the working class. To unpack what the grounds of this haunting and inclusion involve, it is useful to consider the roots of the marginalization experienced by disabled people within capitalist society. As already mentioned, Martha Russell and Ravi Malhotra have argued that exclusion from wage labor lies at the core of disabled people's oppression in every aspect of modern life. And for Mike Oliver, as already suggested, being denied the opportunity to work to make a material contribution to the well-being of society is what translates into disabled people being perceived as other or useless. So Crip composition analysis, by inserting within it a disability logic and presence, generate an autonomous logic whereby, because disability is produced by capitalism as the other of both the relations of production through which it reproduces itself and the society which is defined by these relations, disability grounds a specific perspective which rejects capitalism in its different manifestations. It rejects capitalism as the neoliberal ableism, which subjects all of us to slow death, increased precarity, and growing debility, as Dan Goodley, Rebecca Lawson, Kirsty Lydiard, and Catherine Ranswick-Cole have explored. It rejects capitalism as the neoliberal inclusivism, which allows entrance into capitalist cultures only to the able disabled, while ensuring that while ensuring the exclusion as disposable of the non-laboring populations who are not merely excluded from, but also resistant to standardized labor demands of productivity, as David Mitchell and Charles Snyder argue. And it rejects capitalism as the system which necessitates the enforcement of labor normativity across society as a disciplinary regime and ontological force, in the words of Tanya Aho. So this is just a few examples of people who actually have written about disability and capitalism in very exciting ways. So it's exciting that this discussion group, for me, has so much to build upon, because I think actually amazing stuff has already been written about disability and capitalism. We need to expand that. And this is just a few examples of some of my favorite people and theorists. So overall, out of the marginalization of disabled people within the production process and work-based societies, there emerges a vision that, in the words of Paul Aberley, rejects work as crucially definitional of social membership, as well as the notion that wage work is an activity that disabled people and non-disabled people should be forced to engage with on the threat of impoverishment. And these are the words of Chris Grover and Linda Picott. So from a Crip, no, this is wrong. Okay. So from a Crip autonomist perspective, in my book, I call Crip enchantments such Crip autonomist imaginaries. So for me, Crip enchantments are visions that challenge the logics of capitalism and those of normalcy as inseparable, while visibilizing modes of organizing life alternative to those enjoined by the capitalist mode of production and social reproduction. And my book is a literary studies book, but the concept of Crip enchantments comes out of life and organizing. And I think it's what we experience in our daily life, where we see that starting from disability allows specific critiques of capitalism, but also shows that a richer life and ways of being together and sustaining each other is possible. So social composition analysis is ideally positioned to operate as the link between working class autocritic and Crip enchantments because of its characteristic definitional politics, which is defined by openness to new subjects and processes of subjectification through struggle. So this definitional politics is grounded within a perspective which sees workers and capital as ever-changing economic realities, social formations, and political organizations, in the words of Tronti, on the one hand, and working class struggle as endowed with the same characteristics that will subsequently become attached to the class itself on the other. It paves the way for an expansive conception of the working class, which is alike to those conceptions associated with post-operaism that include a variety of subjects whose labor might be directly or indirectly exploited. In proposing the term compositionism, however, to talk about class composition analysis, Franco Bifo, Franco Bifo Berardi expresses the aim to go beyond a narrow social reference, the workers' opera in Italian, that is implied in the term operaism. For him, social composition or class composition has much more to do with chemistry than with the history of society. So a Crip compositionist approach along these lines examines the processes of subjectification that emerge from the material and symbolic marginalization of disabled people within capitalist society as starting points from which to spread the forms of refusal that they are entangled with. It interrogates the processes whereby capital accumulation is organized in such a way that, in the words of Edward Hall and Robert Wilton, disables people by excluding them from the activity, wage labor, through which people are expected to secure their income, so that only a small number of them can achieve social integration. In relation to the social exclusion and moral othering of disabled people who are unable to work, as Dan Goodley, Paul Rulstone, Grover and Picott, and many others have examined, bearing in mind these processes of capital accumulation and the places of disabled people in them is fundamental. So a Crip Compositionism reads this othering as foundational to the naturalization of a normalizing society that has rigidly developed and maintained structures designed to create a docile workforce. And in the words of Claire Tergaskis, to reward those who most closely conform to socially prescribed ideal models of appearance and behavior. So it does so in order to identify forms of rejection of this othering as privileged locations from which to develop a mass refusal of the operations and logics of capitalist normalcy. So to develop this mass refusal, a Crip Compositionism integrates, I would suggest, this modernist position into working class autocritique. And I will talk about Leonard Davies' idea of this modernism in a second. So on the one hand, for Tronti, a great new season of theoretical discoveries is possible only from the working class point of view, because the capacity for synthesis, Tronti says, lies wholly in working class hands. So the perspective of the working class operates within and against the totality of capitalist society to achieve a partial view that theoretically grasps the totality precisely as a struggle to destroy this totality in practice, Tronti says. On the other hand, this modernist perspective in the concept of Leonard Davies opposes any project which preserves as its universal subject an individual who is diverse, but still whole, independent, unified, self-making, and capable, Davies says. So for this modernism, form follows this function. And on this basis, it disperses the concept of disability so that it applies broadly across society as a civil right for all, the right to be ill, to be infirm, to be impaired without suffering discrimination or oppression. So basically, Davies' concept says that because we are all different, we all need different, we will all need accommodation so as to be able to function without discrimination in society. So the idea, so this modernism goes against universalism as something which is which reproduces the idea of an able-bodied or able-minded universality, and instead says because we are all different, we all have access needs, and so we need to remake society in its entirety so that we can all flourish. So this modernist compositionism, and this is this idea of universal accumulation and universal access or is what inspires me about Davies' idea of this modernism, and I'm really happy to talk more about this modernism, which is a complicated and challenging and challenged concept. So this modernist compositionism for me conflates this modernist synthesis with the synthesis pursued by working class autocritique to challenge the domination of capital over the whole of society by undoing the othering that entrenches the naturalization of capitalist normalcy as a problem for the few rather than for the whole of the working class. So this form of articulation is what connects the strategic vision of Trontian working class autocritique and its cripping, and what must be replicated in theorizing the relationship between the Trontian imagination of the refusal of work and the insertion within it of a disability logic and presence. So for Tronti, the starting point of struggle is where the working class is strongest. And for him, the chain must be broken, not where capital is weakest, but rather where the working class is strongest. And for Tronti, the working class is at its strongest as the productive hinge of society. On Tronti's account, therefore, the only way in which the working class can acquire strength for itself and indeed recognize its strength is through its operation as the only living, active, productive element of society. Within this framework, the development of the power of labor starts at the moment that, Tronti says, laborers are transformed into workers. Because the production process, the act of producing capital, is contemporaneously the moment of the working class struggle against capital. It is a moment that generates the potential for living labor's refusal of activity, which would materialize as the recovery of its autonomy, which is to say precisely the autonomy that the production process has to break. So non-normative and the body minds problematize Tronti's schema because they do not fit the definition of the working class as productive labor that Tronti adopts. Labor is productive for Tronti because in the sense of capitalist production is that wage labor which in the exchange with the variable part of capital not only reproduces this part of capital, but also produces surplus value for capitalists. So labor is productive if it produces surplus value. So the incompatibility between body-minded non-normativity and the production of surplus value means that productive labor does not encompass disabled people, whether these are included or excluded from the workforce. However, as Marx points out, and this is back to what I said at the beginning, that this idea of a productive labor works with this homogeneous idea of the working class, which is basically a fiction, because as Davis says, actually form follows dysfunction. We are all different, and this is something that is incompatible with the idea of a homogeneous working class, which is what capital needs so as to produce surplus value. So for Marx, in Marx's own words, this is actually, so my argument is that this incompatibility between body-minded non-normativity and the production of surplus value, that means that productive labor does not encompass disabled people, actually is not a problem. In Marx's own words, to be a productive laborer is not a piece of luck, but a misfortune. And valorizing the as we know, just thinking, so I don't need to go into why this is the case, because I think we all know what work does to us as disabled people, whether we identify disabled people or not. So valorizing the failure to satisfactorily engage in the capitalist relation of production through body-minded non-normativity and non-productivity, consequently, can be read as possessing the power to erode the ethical superiority of work that presents a major barrier to the possibility to effectively harness people's disenchantment with work into a mass political movement against it. And David Frayne has written about this in very exciting ways. So it is on, yes, so it is, it is on this basis that productivist conceptions of the refusal of work can be cripped and radically transformed through the perspective of a Crip Compositionism, is my argument. So Finkelstein famously argued that disabled people must find ways of engaging in the class struggle. Oh, sorry, it's not here. Must engage with the class struggle where the historical direction of society is fought, won, or lost, in Finkelstein's own words. So if the historical direction of society unfolds towards some form of refusal of work, cripping its possibilities produce an assertion of the autonomy of labor from the standpoint that valorizes non-productivity as what does not reproduce capital. A Crip Compositionism reroutes working class autocritique in the pursuit of a more radical form of refusal of work that does not merely expand outward to include those who occupy non-productive bodies, but rather takes its lead from those whose capacities make them unfit for labor as the baseline of human value. And people like Mitchell and Snyder have written about this, and many others as well. So this vision of refusal of work, delineated by a Crip compositionism, constitutes a departure from Tronti's traditional conception of the refusal of work. For Tronti, the refusal of work indicates something that does not, he says, signify a refusal to give capital the use of one's labor power, since it has already been given to capital once the contract for this particular commodity has been signed, but indicates a momentary blockage of the work process that appears as a recurring threat which derives its content from the process of value creation. Crip compositionism instead envisages as the basis for the refusal of work a prior refusal to submit to the capitalist extraction of surplus value, or a purpose and or a failure to do so. But I will go in a discussion that I have no time here to go into. So this opens up a scenario in which working class organization assumes a content which is wholly alternative because it refuses to function as an articulation of capitalist society. According to Tronti, a refusal of work is generated by the internal displacement, shifts, settlings, and dissolutions that are the process of the self-composition of living society. Struggle, withdrawal, alienation, sabotage, lines of flight from the capitalist system of domination. So because of this modernist conception of society sees non-productivity as belonging to everyone, non-productivity from the capitalist, non-productivity in the capitalist sense. That this modernist working class autocritique produced through a Crip compositionism roots in mass non-productivity its vision of refusal of work. And this vision reads the highest form of the refusal happening when the mass of working class demand simplify and unify into one, the demand for power, all power to the workers, as actually rooted in the non-productivity that we can all oppose to capital. So ultimately, and this is my conclusion, Crip compositionism for me suggests ways in which recognizing disability in our midst renders class struggle inseparable from these modernist processes of subjectification that can expand to the whole social body. By tracing the insertion of a disability logic and presence as constituting perspectives and agents of struggle, Crip compositionisms unleash the potential of autonomist Marxism to include a variety of subjects and processes of subjectification within the political recomposition of the working class. Crip compositions in so doing, but also other Marxist perspectives, which set out to crip the horizons of class struggle by centering disability within these horizons, are what for me makes thinkable and possible a total break with the reproduction of capital. And I've reached the end of my presentation. Thanks. So I'll just stop sharing. So I'll just. So I'll just stop sharing. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Arianna. That was as good as the last time I heard it. Okay, have we anybody who wants to ask any questions? You can ask questions either in the chat box or preferably by microphone, and in the absence of anything else, I'll chair it to make sure we have some order. So is there anybody who wants to start the discussion off? Questions, comments? Obviously, the chat box we're getting rightly praise. Okay, I have with hands up. Who's first? I can't see who's. Luke.
Yeah, that was fantastic. I was just going to suggest, I do have actually 3 questions, but may I suggest that would it be possible to take a 2-3 minute comfort break before the Q&A at all?
Yeah, of course. Is everybody happy to have a brief comfort break? 5 minutes, no more? I'm assuming silence is assent. So let's restart at 8:10, please. We'll have 30 minutes of discussion.
But
Okay, we appear to all be back. I'm going to ask two things as I do this. First of all, we'll take a number of people at once and then give Arianna the opportunity to say something, and we'll do that 2 or 3 times rather than just an interrogative Q&A. But can I ask people to please remember that they're asking questions or giving brief comments and not giving papers from the floor, so to speak, because we have limited time. I want to give people as much opportunity as possible. The order I appear to have is Luke, Ravi, Robert, Ellen, and Nate, and then we'll see what Arianna wants to respond to. So, Luke.
Thanks very much, Paul. Like I say, 3 questions just so I can try and get a bit more clarity on the scope and structure of the argument. It's incredibly rich, and I'm still trying to process it. So the first is a question of operationalization. So what would count as a relevant refusal of capitalism or resistance of capitalism, and perhaps more importantly, how do we explore why perhaps expected forms of resistance or broadenings of critique have failed to develop? I know that's been a big debate within autonomia and operaismo. It's also been a huge debate within the history of the disabled people's movement. So I think, you know, your thoughts on that would be very much appreciated. The second question, and this refers also to something that Irisada brought up in the chat, is how your argument and your analysis deals with the fact that at certain points, it seems that the state has led the composition of the disablement category by deciding what goes within or falls without of it in such a way as it prompts either new forms of subjectification or new forms of collective action. I'm sure we can all think of examples of that in the room, so it'd be great to know how that would factor into your very bottom-up, grassroots upwards forms of compositional analysis. And the third is to what extent the argument that you've outlined relies on a kind of one-to-one exclusion from work, and how you would integrate the continuing kind of underemployment and precarious employment of disabled people within the working class into the argument, which, at least on the structural level, I think the structural analysis is very tight and very cogent, but leans on the exclusion argument as opposed to a looser version of surplus populations, which would include disabled people. So thanks very much. Incredibly rich talk. I'm really looking forward to reading it, but any of that you could respond to, I'd be super, super grateful.
Okay, I think we had Ravi next.
Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So my question is not complicated. It's very basic. I enjoyed the paper. Thank you very much for this contribution. I simply wanted to know what led you to do an analysis with Tronti, because I've been waiting a long time for somebody in disability studies to do work on Tronti and the autonomist tradition. And, you know, apart from people like who are in this room, like Professor Holdren, I don't think there's a whole lot of disability studies. I live in North America, where it's heavily postmodern. To have this paper on Tronti, it's a breath of fresh air, but I'm curious if you wouldn't mind elaborating just a bit on what it is you think is distinctive of Tronti and his contribution to an analysis of class politics, because I was very intrigued. It's not common to see papers on Tronti. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, I think we had Robert next. Robert?
Sorry about that. It took me a while to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Can you hear me?
yes, we can hear you.
Well, first of all, it was a wonderful speech and presentation. I would only say it was probably a rather long and complicated for a Zoom call, but it was very, very good. My question would be, as a disabled activist who's stood for Parliament and stormed Parliament, I would ask, isn't the social model can be used as a double-edged sword? Because whilst we want equality and to be part of a society as revolutionary Marxists, we don't necessarily want to enhance and develop the capitalist system, but want to bring it to its knees and replace it with something which doesn't disable us and rely on impairment models. So therefore, how do we level the the seesaw in a way that allows us to both free people from oppression, but also break down capitalism?
Thank you. Ellen?
Thanks, Arianna. I really love this paper, and I particularly like that idea about inserting a disability logic and presence. And so I guess also from an activist perspective, I just wanted your ideas on what that would look like in terms of organising. Thank you.
And Nate?
Thank you. This is a great event and a great paper. I wanted to say, I think as Marxists, we still live in a capitalist society, and I think one of the benefits of the framework that this event is taking of being pluralist, I think, is really demonstrated by this paper. So my own kind of work tends to be more, at this point, more kind of in a critical theory tradition, which looks at what's done to people. And this paper is a powerful statement of the value of the autonomous tradition of people's own agency. And one of the kinds of work I do, often some of the limitations is that it can end up accidentally playing into kind of liberal stories of like, oh, those poor people, we need technocrats to fix this for us. And I do think there's value in the kinds of critical theory traditions and so on, and what that tracks onto. But I think part of what Arianna's paper brings out is that this sort of like the kind of autonomous, kind of explosive power of people themselves, power from below, I think is really itself an important contribution. I think to my mind, it also helps kind of help think about the value of being pluralists on this within the Marxist tradition, that this isn't a matter of like our preferred corner. This is how I tend to think about it is, well, I have my preferred corner of Marxism, and then we'll just figure out how to move from there into disability studies. But actually showing that the taking disability seriously probably works best is going to inflect how we think of the across the plurality of the Marxist tradition. And then also as a piece of that being the different aspects of the Marxist tradition respond in different ways to how the capitalist state and capitalist society treat disability. And so, like I said, my own stuff I think is I like it. I think it makes contribution, but it does end up uneasily close to a kind of poor me facilitating the state. Whereas Arianna's, where I think this really draws out a perspective that I think is very hard for this is you're articulating politics. I think it'd be very, very hard, especially in neoliberal capitalism specifically, for the state to kind of wrap itself around and to say, oh yeah, we know how to manage you by giving you a little bit of what you want. So I think it's in the immediate object, and also as a contribution to a larger conversation about how we as a group can talk about capitalism and disability. I think this is just fantastic work.
Okay, thanks very much. Arianna, would you like to come back and say something at this point?
Oh, yes. Thanks so much for these amazing points and comments, questions. Just a point before, I was in I don't know, Richard Curry, if you were raising the hand before, but just to check. Yeah. So we'll keep an eye on the chat as well. Okay, so yeah, so thanks so much for the amazing points and questions, and they are just they will keep me thinking, and it would be cool then just to open up for discussions on that, so that other people can maybe comment on these great points too. Yeah, so just starting, Luke, for your three great points and questions. I'm not sure if I will be able to answer them. So yes, so if then you would like to come back and yeah, and give your own thoughts. So I will try to keep my answers brief, so maybe there is more time for discussion. Yeah, so what counts as a refusal of capitalism, and how can we expand the conception of resistance? So I think for me, yeah, so for me, the idea is that so I identify as disabled, so I will say we, but in a just in that very expansive we that of a disability encounter, and in that idea that disability is relevant to the whole of society. So we'll talk about we in this sense, but in the sense of we may want and seek and do our best to fit in a workplace, to apply for a job when we are where we don't have one, but from as disabled people, often we see that what we get is we run ourselves into the ground, and then there is not a safety net that supports us, and we may try and apply for benefits, disability benefits. We may get them and be constantly under threat or being refused them, so we can do our best to survive under capitalism. And I think at a certain point we realize that we need support from each other, first of all, just because individually we may spend and that's probably what in a way or other we will be doing. We will spend our life to survive by fitting a job, getting accommodation, trying to get benefits, trying not to lose benefits. That's our life. But I think refusal of capitalism starting from a disability logic and presence starts from the idea that that's an inevitable struggle, but that's something that can also be rethought as a starting point for building networks of mutual support or of Crip mutual aid, or so these informal networks of support that can give us ideas about how to beat the DWP, Department of Work and Pensions, if we are in the UK, or beat any kind of state authority, just not following the rules, but by sharing knowledge with each other so as to work out ways for surviving just through the shared knowledge that we have of the limits that workplaces or healthcare or welfare authorities have in place not to support us. So once we start from that starting point that we don't fit capitalism and that we can try to do so, and that's going to make us worse in terms of our health, our just possibility to survive. Once we get to that point that we know that that's normal, that it's very difficult for us to survive, and because the system is not meant to support our survival, at that point we start looking for solidarity links, for knowledge of other people, whether they're activists or not, but people who have struggled in this way. So at that point, for me, sharing of knowledge is support and ways of beating the system, not following its rules, whether it's work or welfare or healthcare, is a refusal of capitalism, just because we refuse its logic, whether or not we, regardless of the paths we choose to navigate those barriers to our survival. That sharing of logic and that tactics that we develop to survive, not following the logics that capitalist normacy tries to present as the only available logic, that's for me is a kind of refusal of capitalism. I see it as a myriad of different actions or moments of material actions, but also moments of symbolic refusal of accepting that as the only reality that exists for us. So at that moment, so it's this more lived experience, this collective lived experience that for me generates a myriad forms of refusal, and that so I was thinking in this very diffuse sense, and I'm sure there are better examples or other ways of seeing this. But maybe a limit of my approach is that I wasn't really thinking of just one big organization. I see organizations like DPAC or welfare rights groups like the one I'm part of, this Edinburgh Coalition Against Poverty, but also disabled friends I have, people who don't identify as disabled, but that I've met in my life that have been struggling against healthcare institutions. I think these are the kind of collectivities that I'm thinking of. And the other point, at certain points, the state has led the composition of the disabled category, and that point, that really key point about how that very much frames how we develop forms of subjectification and collective action. I think that's an amazing question, I think that for me, so I think in answering this question, I'm coming from the perspective of welfare rights organizing, that in my own activist group, and I know that there are limits in coming from just one perspective, but from the lived experience I have, in our group, we are all disabled, but we organize just to support anyone who needs support in dealing with poverty issues or with welfare authorities. So for us, not everyone identifies as disabled. Most people probably will not identify as disabled. So I think that starting from mutual aid really helps, just because it evades that form of identification as a starting point for organizing, which I know is really important for driving specific forms of organizing forward. But at the moment of engaging people who experience who need to deal with welfare rights authorities, I think a starting point that that starts just from the moment of mutual aid, and from a perspective of mutual aid helps, because it allows to critique the categories that welfare rights authorities provide to us to conceptualize ourselves. And it's a very, and as I'm sure so many people in this call know, just the moment of going through the descriptors and working with people to work out ways of answering those questions, or preparing for interviews, just totally deconstructs the reality of those categories as provided by the state for us, and puts us in a position when we know really well that those categories have no connection to us, and our engagement with those categories is just a struggle for survival. But it's not, but our lived experience has absolutely no connection with those categories which are set out so as to deprive us of our of the benefits that belongs to us. They belong to us just because the world has been appropriated by capitalism. So we have no alternative ways of surviving apart from engaging in wage work or of having benefits. So I think and I suppose with healthcare is another very good example, where we know that, again, whenever we encounter our, I don't know, specialist nurses or medical authorities, it's always a struggle whether we need to do what they want, either to survive or to be able to have proof from them that they need, that we have a right to accommodation within the workplace. Should I decide just not to take the medication that my specialist nurse wants me to take, I know that I won't get her support for accommodation in the workplace. Or so I think that moment of slippage between what we are defined by and what we know we are, and that connection to why we need to engage with these state sanctioned definitions of what we are in order to survive under capitalism. I think that moment of encounter, struggle, and realization that there is an incompatibility and the slippage there, I think it's a starting point just to question this, the ways in which the state leads the composition of the disabled category, and to have categories that come out of our own movements. And disabled people's organization are places where we want to have those, or those conversations, as well as autonomous groups of mutual aid, whether they are abled or they present themselves as abled, or in what people have been calling Crip mutual aid. And yeah, the third question, that I was talking about exclusion, exclusion from work as opposed to underemployment, for example, and surplus population. I think, and that's an amazing question again. Maybe you want to say more about all these three, because I realize I'm answering in a very messy fashion, but that's just because your questions are so cool and so key and complex. So maybe a simplistic answer could be that from the very narrow perspective of welfare rights activism, I really much think disability as connected just through the lenses of what we've been experiencing, whereby in the UK, I must say, for those of us who are not based in the UK, we have the benefit system whereby there are disability benefits connected, which are both, which disabled people can apply for, whether they are in work or out of work. And then we also have a benefit, which is universal credit, that many of us who may not get disability benefits, but who are or identify as disabled apply for. So there is really a blurring of lines between underemployment and claiming benefits. So and so in a way, whenever I think of exclusion of work, you are totally right. It's really reductive. It's very reductive. And in a way, I'm maybe, so that's a great point for me to think more through. But in talking about that refusal of work is more about a moment of saying, I know that I could bend to the pressure of my work coach and apply and do this job, and I know that is going to run me into the ground, to really make me unwell. So I need to resist and refuse that. I need to work out strategies so as to trick my work coach into thinking I've applied for that job, but I cannot do that, because otherwise my life will be destroyed. Whether my biological life or my social life, it doesn't really matter. So I think the refusal of work I'm thinking of is that saying, no, this is going to kill me in a whether making me really unwell physically or just destroying myself as a person socially, where I can see the joy in life as opposed to just struggling on because I have done what my work coach has ordered me to do. So I think the refusal of work, this idea of being out of work, is just saying, putting a barrier against work which destroys us, whether it's underemployment or it's very good employment that still destroys us, whether it's very few hours or many hours, whether the harassment comes from the job coach wanting us to work or work itself. So that the refusal of work is more at the level of subjectification of being against work, so as to develop strategies, and sharing these strategies we develop through experience with others, so as to protect ourselves as a collective, we against work and the compulsion to work that state and that welfare as well as healthcare authorities push us towards. I don't know, Luke, if I've answered your questions, probably not, but if you want to come in then, or other people want to answer, that would be cool. So Ravi's great question, why I have chosen Tronti. So that's an amazing question. Thanks so much. So, I think I've been really frustrated with a lot of Marxist theory and discussions within reading groups and friends and comrades because of that productivist framework of Marxist theory. And for me, autonomist Marxism is a kind of, and we know that autonomist Marxism has different strands, but for me, autonomist Marxism, I really like that reversal of perspective, that perspective of struggle. Yet Italian autonomism, so I'm really passionate about exploring theories, autonomist theories, just because I'm excited about the perspective of struggle that they provide. So, but what I'm really frustrated by is by a lot of autonomist theories that preserve and reproduce that productivist focus that for me is incompatible with disability or with just our lives of non-normative body mind. So Tronti is as this very, so why I chose Tronti is because he has a very strong productivist framework. So I thought I need to start engaging with this problem of this productive hinge of society, as where we see the struggle of the working class to come out of. And that's for me important, because just in daily life, for example, I was at a meeting of a disabled people's organization, and there was a socialist invited speaker who was talking about how the energy crisis is bad for disabled workers. And that idea of disabled workers was so as to preserve the dignity of disabled people as being victims of this energy crisis. And that is what really worries me, because there is this idea. So in order to get to the bottom of why we need to be disabled workers so as to be part of the working class, and the limits of that, I thought I need to explore. And so I explore different theories. So Tronti is just one that I think is really easy to critique. There are more complex ones, even just in Italian autonomism. But Tronti is an easy target, but especially for me, it's useful to unpack this to unpack the logic of this productivist framework, so as to be able to understand it and understand these ableist and disablest categories that Marxist theory tends to work with, and that for me, and that as a disabled or person or a Crip autonomist, I just can't accept this reproduction of ableism and disablest categories within Marxist theory. That's for me the real problem, because we know that capitalism and capital can't really manage us as disabled people, really. And that's why ableism and disablest categories are entwined with capitalism. But Marxist theory reproducing those, that's where I'm interested. That's what I'm interested in critiquing. So that's why Tronti, because it was an easier target from this critique and exploration. It's a very not very clever answer, but Robert's great point. Again, that's so inspiring. What you were saying about us as disabled people not wanting to enhance and develop the capitalist system, but wanting to bring it to its knees, so that it can't keep disabling us. And so how do we do that? I think that's a key point, because I think as disabled people, we have a particularly keen appreciation that by enhancing, fixing, transforming, reforming the capitalism, we are not really going to stop it from bringing us as disabled people into dangerous modes of life. So I think for me, freeing people from oppression and breaking capitalism are two sides of the same coin, and I really don't know what comes first, but as Paul Aberley and others have been pointing out, after we break capitalism, we are not necessarily in a place where our oppression as disabled people will be over, unless we challenge the workerist framework of the future society that we think of. That's why engaging with any labor movement is important, just because it's not the end of our oppression if we have a socialist society that is still based on our contribution to a standardized system of work. I think I will still be as disastrous as I'm here. So under capitalism. So I think that the starting point is saying capitalism can't be reformed, and as disabled people, that's our starting point in saying our conditions of life, we demand those to be improved through struggle and through action, to direct action, and through all forms of action, even from our couches, from our physical. But so we will struggle against capitalism. We will create problems for it, because we are struggling for our survival. At the same time, we know that we need to break that capitalism, but at the same time, we need to challenge the labor movement and future visions of society that have that risk reproducing those categories that make for oppression of ourselves and the whole of society. Ellen's great point about how this, thanks so much, Ellen, how this perspective, this insertion of a disability logic and presence would look like in organizing. Thanks so much. I think for me, a starting point would be really starting from the perspective of people who identify as disabled in any group we are part of, and we know that's not possible all the time. In most groups, it's not even possible to just participate at all, because spaces are not accessible and do not want to go through processes of transformations so as to become more accessible. So starting point for me is really saying this is a perspective that is not present, and we want to include that, because struggle rooted through this perspective allows, is fundamental. We have a right to it, and second, it makes for much better organizing. But even if it didn't, we are here, and this perspective does belong, and so it needs to be taken on board and the space transformed on these spaces. And for me, welfare rights organizations, I know I'm partial to those, are very good, just because as disabled people, we populate welfare rights groups a lot. So, and from a perspective that starts by struggling with those categories that, as Luke was saying at the beginning, kind of over-determined forms of identification. So, so I would say making sure that the organizing takes on board what comes out of the perspective of people who identify as disabled. I suppose in trade unions, maybe other people can say more, but maybe I don't know if Joanna is still there. I don't know, but she knows a lot about trade unions. I've given up on those. So I can't really say much, and it's my fault. So I'm part of a trade union, but I can't say much. But Joanna can, and yeah. So So Nate, thank you so much for your really kind comments, and I think the point that you make about those liberal stories of technocratic fixes that are offered to us, and as disabled people, and in general as the way forward. I think there are a perspective of struggle is a challenge against those, and these and is totally and it's something that really starts from the mapping of through a variety, like you're saying, through a pluralist, through a variety of approaches in Marxist theory to the phenomenon of disability as a socioeconomic and political phenomenon. So I think that point about the richness of a pluralist approach to disability under capitalism, I think it's an amazing point, just because because that pluralism is what illuminates aspects that just a one-fits-all approach just couldn't capture. And so I think it's a great point for me to end on, because this is the way forward, and this is what this group, I think, will be amazing for. Yeah, sorry, for waffling on so much.
Okay. Time is passing, but I'm acutely aware that Elizabeth was very patient with her hand up. So what I'm going to suggest is, if Elizabeth still wants to say something, she does. Then if we have any last comment, and then we'll wind it up and we'll explain what's going to happen in the next month. So the floor is yours if you wish it, Elizabeth.
Oh, I just said in the chat that it was kind of answered. I want to hear more, but we've got many more weeks about obviously some parts of the movement. I'm thinking particularly of people who are intellectually disabled and in Australia are not able to earn the base wage. They are underpaid, they're paid like almost ration wages. Claims around rights-based claims around equality in relation to work, how we can see a way through those questions of inclusion in the workforce and a refusal within the community. But there's many more weeks to talk about these things. Yeah.
Okay, I can see Richard waving. If it's a very quick point, Richard.
Yeah, just to say, because I think for me, Crip, the power of Crip thinking is also the celebration of Crip culture. And also I find sometimes at the end of these meetings, when we've spoken about the destruction of capitalism, it can seem quite overwhelming. So to cheer yourself up, I'd recommend going and watching a couple of documentaries. Crip Camp, which shows the power of disabled people and in America to live independently, and also when Barbara met Alan, which is again unfortunately based in the UK, but it's a real kind of celebration of Crip power and Crip culture that kind of puts a hopeful spin on things. So just like to finish on that.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. Some of us are cursed to live in the UK, that is true. Thanks very much, everybody, for staying. Thanks very much, Arianna, for an excellent paper.